sometimes Samuel included in as a judge. We're not going to consider him a judge in our study tonight, but some do consider him. And certainly he acted somewhat like one, but he was acted more like a prophet, didn't he, than he did a judge. But I could see why someone might have thought that, because he was the last one, the last messenger sent from God before the king thing happened, right? Samson, he has, we'll take some time with Samson. He is an interesting character that we know a lot about. At least we talk about him a lot. Jephthah is an enigma, okay? So we will spend some time thinking about him because he's not your norm, you know. So we'll look at these judges. Here's a list of them. Can you see that at all from the front? I know, okay, not terrible. It's a little fuzzy up there. It's great here. Here, you want to see it on my computer? But it begins with Othniel, and he was a relative of who? All right, Caleb, okay? And, you know, it's interesting to me, the far right column where it talks about how much rest they got. I thought maybe there was a correlation between the years of oppression to the years of rest, but there's no correlation. It's what happens, what drives rest in this case? Israel's behavior, doesn't it? If their behavior follows God's will, then they have rest. You know, when it doesn't, then some enemy comes in to oppress them. And some of the oppression is very acute, some is long-term, some they steal the very food out of their mouth. So we'll talk about that a little, but the oppression was permitted to happen, and there was a reason for it. We'll talk about that. I think I tried to blow it up a little bit here. You know, it seems like the longest, there's 80 years for Ehud, who had defeated the Moabites, and I tried to find, is there a reason that happened? I think maybe the Moabites was a difficult group of people. So maybe when others saw them get defeated, they kind of hung back a little bit. Don't know, you know. I mean, they're people like you and I. So when they see something like that, they may think like me. Well, you know, maybe I better think twice. Right? But they had 80 years. Plus, what else? The people were following God's will through that time. Okay, I want to go. Let's see. We talked enough, I think, about those guys. But I do have a list if you needed a list, okay? Here are some themes that we can look for in here. And this is where you might think, wow, Judges is a bummer, okay? Because there's a cycle we see here, right? Cycle of sin, a return, a supplication, and salvation, okay? And we see that the cycle kind of play out, if you will, throughout Judges. Okay? I have a bigger version of this I'll show in a second. We also see a nation in decline, don't we? They started out, they had taken the land, they ended on a high, if you will. But we see that their willingness to stay away from idols and to not pass the test, because we find in Judges that the people were left there to test them. And they kind of routinely would fail that test. So they needed God. And so God would send someone to oppress them. They would then repent. God would save them. Then they would have rest. Okay, and that repeats throughout, really, the book of Judges. Now, that's kind of how the cycle for Judges. If we were studying Kings, the Kings, is kind of a similar process, okay? Less crisply cyclical, but the same idea, right? You get a king in, he fails to follow God's will, somebody comes in, overthrows them, and eventually, I don't know if anyone here has a Thompson chain Bible. You can get new ones, but most of them are a little older. In the back of that, in the help section, if you will, there's a picture in there. Their way of showing this, the kings happening, I think is similar to what we might see a little in Judges, but less so really, where the kings were mountains, okay, and valleys. Guess who the high ones were? Good kings. The low ones were bad kings. Eventually, there was no difference between a mountaintop and the valley, okay? And that's what happened with kings. Well, I think we end this with a situation that maybe prompts, if you will, their desire for a king. And we see the problems that brings up. And some of the reasons that they left, I think that they made covenants. The issues was this, really. They made covenants with the inhabitants of the land. I mean, that's the bottom line. So they were supposed to have purged them, and instead they left them, and then didn't just leave them. They decided to marry them and let them marry their family. They decided to throw out God and to worship idols. Okay. You see here in, I'm trying to find this here. This initial chapter 2, okay, verses 1 to 5, we're going to be kind of moving around a little bit here with this subject. But the angel of the Lord came from Gilgal and went to this location called Bochum. And Bochum's, that word means weepers. Okay, that's the name they gave this, because the angel of the Lord told them how they needed to act and told them where they were failing, right? And so verse 3, God says, "So now I say, I will not drive them out before you." So he's going to stop driving out the people of the land from before Israel. And it says in verse 4, "As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people lifted up their voices and wept." Once again, that is kind of part of the whole cyclical process here. When the people saw themselves and what that meant their behavior and what it meant, then they would come back to God. But they call that place Bochum because what do you think that word means? Weepers, okay? Because of what happened there. A lot of the biblical city names had a meaning to them. Verse 23, and then we'll go past this, says, "So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua." Okay. It was a test. It was going to be a test. Okay. And we see God's presence throughout Judges. We see Othniel, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson having the Spirit of the Lord. Okay, it's kind of referred to as kind of coming over them. We have the angel then who came and tried to instruct them and tell them the way they needed to go. So God's presence is noted, if you will, throughout Judges. So in other words, they weren't left alone. Okay. So here's that cycle again. So Israel does evil. Generally, it's usually meant they were either engaged in idolatry or some other subversion to what God had asked them to do. God would send them a prophet or someone to tell them, angel of the Lord or whatever, to tell them what they were doing. And so God then sent enemies to punish the Israelites. They would be put under subject to other countries. They would then suffer because of that, and because of the suffering, they would cry out to the Lord. They would basically repent. There was usually some act of faith that had to be achieved. And most of the time, what was it? Toss out the idols, okay? Toss out the idols. They had to have some way they would demonstrate that they heard it, they're going to change their way. So there was some act of faith. God then raises a judge who saves Israel, and then peace happens for a while. They go by way of all man, where we are a little forgetful when people do nice things for us. Sometimes we're a little forgetful of that. They would forget God, and then it would start all over again. So that's what we're going to see in Judges. This, I think, is an interesting chart that I had found. There's a lot of parallel, if you will, and in some cases almost 100% same wording between Joshua and Judges. And I just wanted to show you this and let you know that there are those subjects, if you will, that cross over. Or even they're stated in Judges as if it's happening, but it has already happened, kind of thing. The first two with Caleb we found in Joshua, didn't we? In talking about Caleb. And then in Judges we find something similar, just kind of a reference to the fact that he had taken that land and had killed giants in doing that. But there's some issues too that come out. Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites. Who drives out the Jebusites finally? David. Okay? So the Jebusites live, own, however you want to put it, Jerusalem, until David comes and overthrows them. Ephraim did not drive out Canaanites. We're going to see tonight sort of that's part of the whole spiral down, if you will, of Israel, that they did not drive out all of the people they were supposed to from the cities they were taking over. Manasseh would then put Canaanites to forced labor. Okay, so many of them, while still not following God's will, they would get strong enough to make them subjects, and then they would turn them into basically workers, slave labor, if you will, to them, and instead of purging that area. It even chased out some of them to the mountains area. So in other words, some of the land and flat land is at a premium in that area, okay? So if you had the flat land, you wanted it. If somebody else had your flat land, you wanted that flat land. But many of them that held that area were too strong, and they didn't defeat them, bottom line. And they ran off into the mountains, if you will, almost in a way hiding from it. I found this chart. I don't know if you're going to be able to read it as well, but I do like it because it shows us a couple of things. We're reading in Judges about people that are referenced in Hebrews 11. What type of people are really talked about in Hebrews 11? Okay, they were known, right? They were called out for the faith that they demonstrated. And there's a couple of kind of oddities that we'll talk about when we get to that part there. But we see in this chart the words that have the red asterisk next to it are the ones that are found in Hebrews 11. So Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson were all talked about, and we kind of call it, maybe wrong, but the Hall of Faith, if you will, those that were known because of their faith. Some of the others here may have had faith, don't know what would characterize the difference in that, but could just be the writer of Hebrews ran out of space. I don't know why. Some aren't. Some I get an idea. You'll get an idea why not. And then we get into this cultural decline. You know, when a country gets known for its corruption or gets known for violence or for lawlessness, etc., how is it usually referred to? It's in decline, right? Think of it as in decline. And there were some things that happened in the last few chapters of Judges that kind of point to this cultural, social decline in the Israelites. And some are just actually shocking. I mean, I would hate to be a teacher of a small class and try to talk about some of the things that happen in the last few chapters here of Judges. Okay. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but I'm going to flash this for you. Okay, it's a great chart, but you really need to have it yourself to follow it. Okay, this is Judges in one screen. Okay, and it covers every chapter, and it's got all the actors and everyone in there. You can't read it from where you are. But if you ever wanted to get this, it is something that you can get from YouTube. But the bottom line, though, is what it does demonstrate is what happens to each of the leaders, what the leaders had to do to save Israel, what Israel did to get them back in trouble again. Okay. This is an interesting character, Shamgar. Okay, what does Shamgar known for? He's known for only one thing. This is the only verse that talks about Shamgar. Okay, that he killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad. Now, I really don't think this is proper ox goad because they did not have any kind of metal on the end of an ox goad. Okay, it was just a stick. It's just a pointy stick. Okay, so that every time I hear this and read this, I think, wow, a stick. That meant you killed 600 people with a stick. But he was saving them. Okay, and you don't hear a whole lot about him. You don't see a whole lot about him, but it is interesting. We talked about this before, and we'll have it again in this this chapter. In this book. Strange weapons. Okay. So once again, kind of, I think, to underline that without God, they were not going to defeat these enemies. Okay. Just look at the weapons. Okay. One is they walked around the walls, right, of Jericho, blew a trumpet, and it fell down. Okay, so that's probably not a winning military idea, right? With Ehud, he made a homemade dagger. Okay, they didn't have any weapons, okay, because they were under siege and they would not let them have weapons. Okay, and so he made his own kind of and we'll talk about him. Took a king's life to overthrow their oppression. Shamgar had a stick. Barak, thunderstorm, rain, okay, and a river flooding. Okay. Now there are some other things that happen, not in Judges, that are just as strange, like a rumor sending a whole army back to their country. Okay, I mean those are the kind of things that only God could make happen. Jael, a hammer and a tent peg. Okay. Gideon, pitchers, torches, and trumpets. Doesn't sound like a real military effort, does it? Samson kills a lion with his bare hands, ties foxes' tails together, okay, burns their fields, and used the jawbone of a donkey, right, to kill to defend himself, if you will, against a couple thousand people. And then the last is David with a sling and a stone. Okay. Now these aren't the only ones, but the point is this, okay? And it is really the sort of the silver lining, if you will, in the cloud of Judges. And that is God, when God is for you and with you, then you're going to be able to defeat whatever the enemy is, right? And so we have a lot of what I would call maybe negativity here, but I'm going to go past that. Negativity here, but God is with them, and when God's with us, we too can defeat whatever the enemy is that we're facing. I had, it was very clear in Joshua, be strong and courageous. Okay, I mean, it was easy to find something to rally around. While this may be negative, it has a couple of ways to read this verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, what was wrong with that statement? Was there a king in Israel? Yeah, God. God was supposed to be their king. And they were failing to listen to him as their king. They wanted a physical king. Remember when we actually get into that part where they're going to want a king, and they want to be like all the other nations. Well, they weren't like the other nations, and they didn't have to be, but they wanted to be. They wanted someone to look at and say, there's our king. But they had a king, but they just was ignoring him. Okay? We have a king. We just need to be sure we don't ignore him. Okay? So I tried to kind of divide this up. We're not going to be doing just 3 studies. I think there's 4. Tonight we're going to do our best to talk about the apostasy that happens and sort of the cycle of issues that they may have. But and then we may get into some of the campaigns tonight if we have time for that. But so in the apostasy, they would fail to obey. We have campaigns. The campaigns are really meant to represent the individual judges and the battle, if you will, to overthrow whatever was oppressing them, whatever country. Okay, and then the sort of social, spiritual, cultural decline that we see in the last parts of Judges, which do not bode well for the future for them. Okay, I'm going to let you guess. This isn't as good as Jeopardy, okay? But from 1 to 10, do you know how many times this phrase "did not drive out" appear in Judges? Well, believe it or not, it did not appear in Joshua either. Or it did appear in Joshua too. 3 times in Joshua, 9 times in Judges, we find this phrase. So if we're wondering, why did this happen? Why did this cycle? Okay, I think these phrases might give us an idea. So there was 3 in Joshua, 9 in Judges. Did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That is a very ominous sentence, isn't it? Doing evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay. That was 7 times in Judges. We find what the Israelites were doing would mean this phrase, or would support this phrase. Serve the Baals. So God distinctly says, do not worship the Baals, do not worship the idols, and 5 times we find in there they went and served the Baals. Okay. Now, there are other things they do, but these are probably, if you will, the heart issues, their heart, okay? Abandon the Lord. Okay, we find that 2 times. I would say if you serve the Baals, you're abandoning the Lord. But this is what the author of the book of Judges, okay, the divine author of Judges wrote. No king in Israel, which is sad because there was a king, but they just wasn't listening to him. And did what was right in his own eyes. Oh, that's kind of scary, isn't it? If someone does that today, we find that we call them to be not following the law. But it happens so often today, I don't know what we'd call it. That maybe more typical than atypical. But 4 times it says they did what was right in their own eyes. Okay. Kind of a sad jeopardy, but at the same time, I think we can see what happens, if you will, to Israel in these statements here. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what we mean. Now, there was a time period that after the death of Joshua, and if you have your Bibles, you can follow along in this, but after his death, right, Israel, of course, lost a critical godly leadership, didn't they, when he dies. And Moses was a great leader. They were kind of basking, if you will, in having that divine supported leadership there with them. But when Joshua died, he didn't really pick someone to take his place, did he? There wasn't some leader that came in and filled in, if you will, behind him. They were supposed to follow the law, right? And then they were also supposed to follow their king, God, but they were not really doing that. This period of Judges lasts about maybe 340 years or so, and then after this we get into Samuel's time with, and eventually the king coming in place. But it's about 1,000 years, a little over 1,000 years, isn't it, before Christ comes. Okay. So these leaders, okay, Joshua did not say this one person is going to be head over all the nation of Israel. And so God chooses leaders once they need them, right? And that's really what Judges is. This term of judge doesn't mean, as we said, someone who sits in court, but could mean a military leader, could be a spiritual leader, could even be a local leader, okay? Because a couple of the judges are actually more localized in what they save, who they save, if you will. So when you look at verses 1 and 2, we find he's gone. Okay, when he's going to be gone. It's a little puzzling because after the death of Joshua, we're told something, but later we find he dies. Okay, so it's a little difficult to keep some of this in order. But they were wondering. So he didn't pick someone, and so they're wondering who goes first. Isn't that kind of what it's saying here? Who's going to go first? Who's going to go in and occupy their land? Who's going to complete their occupation, if you will? And so Judah is chosen, right? So Judah is chosen, and hang on, let me catch up here with my mouth. All right. But he asked the tribe of Simeon, will you please help me? If you help me, then I'll help you. And so they do that, and they fight against the Canaanites. And Simeon went with him. Judah went up. They fought against them, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Okay. One wonders why they did that, okay? But it seems that possibly he did that. That was what that king did too, okay, to people he caught, And so I guess maybe turnabout was fair play. But he brought him back to Jerusalem with him, and there he died. Okay. Okay, so the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites, if you will, into the hand of Judah. Okay. Yes. Your balance is gone. That's what they say. You know, I guess you can use a little one, but if you lose your big one, you kind of walk funny. I don't know. But, you know, they were physical. I mean, you're talking hand to hand, right? That's how they fought, really, in those days. I'm trying to look through here to some of the things that we can point out about this. Okay, Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it, but it's recorded that that they fell to them. But it was under the leadership of the King David that they actually conquered the city 200 years later. So there's some question, what did he do? He says they fought against Jerusalem and maybe subjugated part of it or whatever, but the entire area that was called the city of David was not taken until David did it. And we see that in 2 Samuel chapter 5 when he does that. Okay, it's one of the Jerusalem is one of the oldest cities there, but they went up, fought against Hebron. They were able to win that, but there were mountainous. You're talking mountains. Jerusalem's on a mountain. What's it called? Mount Zion, right? It's a mountain. Okay, so it's on top of that, if you will. But now we start to see some challenges, right? Benjamin does not take possession of Jerusalem. They did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited it. So they dwelled with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to the day of this writing, right? Whoever the author was that's writing about here. This was the case where the battle had been won, but they did not move in and displace them, okay, if you will. All right, so this is the beginning of hearing this about most of the remaining tribes, okay, where they would go in and they would fail to fully take the land that had been allocated to them. They would not destroy. There was really the main reason they were asked to go in and purge was to do what? To destroy the altars and the idols. That's what was really the main purpose of it. And then to not have those left who had worshipped it so that they would then raise it up again, right? The house of Joseph then conquers the city of Bethel. This would do well if I had maps, but we would just need a whole lot of different kinds of maps to show some of this. You might have some that you want to look at. But it's interesting. They combined two tribes that came from Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they kind of called it the house of Joseph, okay, in this case. So that's why some of the discussions that are in here about them sound like you're talking about one group of people, but it's actually a couple of the tribes or the sons of Joseph that they combined together and kind of reference them that way. Let's see, what else can we do here? Now let's look at Manasseh. Manasseh is an issue, a big issue. So Manasseh and Ephraim fail to drive out theirs. It said Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean or its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages. And he goes through a list here. He says, for the Canaanites persisted in the dwelling in that land. Okay, so let's kind of rewind a minute. You still have Joshua. They didn't, but you still have Joshua leading you. Do you think that this would still be what happened? No. So their willingness, their spiritual strength is being lessened and siphoned off, okay, from them. And, maybe it's easy now, we're looking back to be hard on them, but think of this yourself, okay? You don't have that single star to follow, right? Joshua. And we have this kind of situation today because we can't see God, we can't see Jesus, but we believe God, we believe in Jesus. What's it take? Faith. And that's what keeps getting leached out of the tribes when they go in to take land. Now they're on their own. They think, I'm on my own. Why is that? Well, they're not following God, okay? And I think that there's an allurement there, okay? They built these nice cities. They've got these big vineyards. They've got all of this cattle, and look at all of what they accomplished. You would have to really be strong, would you not, to go in there and destroy all of them and take that away from them. But you would have had to have really been following God's purpose in this case. And so many of them fell. They did say, at least in verse 28, that when they grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but that's not what God said, is it? He didn't say go in there and make them your slaves or forced labor or indentured servants or whatever. He didn't say that because he was worried about the idols. And if you leave the people there who were worshiping those idols, they will raise those idols again, won't they? And that's what happens, and we see that. Zebulun, okay, verse 30 compromises. He did not drive out the inhabitants, okay? So the Canaanites, they said, lived among them, but they became subject to forced labor. Now, when you're in charge, forced labor works, but when you're no longer in charge, what happens to the forced labor? Now, they're part of those who are overthrowing you, right? And so this does not work, but it is how they began to deal with the Canaanites. It's also that because the crisis hadn't happened yet and because the crisis wasn't immediate, we have the same tendency today, don't we, to procrastinate or to put off or to think you got a better idea until that idea fails. I mean, they're kind of like us, you know, they may have that kind of life, okay? When we look at Asher, they failed to take full possession of their land, and so they didn't drive out the inhabitants of the area that they had been given. And this was really a very difficult one. The Asherites lived among the Canaanites then, the inhabitants of the land, and they did not drive them out. And so there is a god, if you will, a idol. I hate to call it a god, an idol that's an Asherah, right? And the Asherah was a goddess or a god of fertility, okay? And they would worship them, and they would bring them into the Israelites. Naphtali compromises. There's just one verse for Naphtali. In some ways, you might feel a little bit of disgust, being disgusted. You know, you just have one verse in here for them. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshemesh. Okay, so they lived among the Canaanites. Next week, we will see the fruit of this. Okay, so let's say the fruit is being planted here. Next week, we'll see what that fruit bears. Okay, in what happens to the Israelites then.